that most other tellings of the Alamo, we'll get into like historicity and all that stuff, but it was a movement of both Tejanos and Texians who wanted independence from the Central Mexican government.
Yeah, interesting hybrid culture there. So different reasons to distrust the central authority and the weak hold that the central government has on it up into the north. Perhaps them hoping it would be a buffer state due to it being hot and arid and sparsely populated, like the way the Roman Empire had the Sahara, thinking that this can ward off any attacks from the south and we can have our African coastal cities. Sorry, Mexico, not to be. It's contiguous land area, so that's not going to work.
Yeah. Now this leads us to the road to the Alamo. The Texan army had some initial successes because the Mexican army did not have a lot of troops or supplies or anything they really needed in Texas at that time. The Texans took some key towns, including San Antonio. Now, this was during the dead of winter, and they didn't expect the Mexican army to be able to respond until spring. A lot of this happened in late fall, early winter, and they thought that they had a good 5-6 months before, the Mexican army could really get rolling. But Santa Anna, who was known as the Napoleon of the West, he didn't stand around for a second. He was convinced that the professional Mexican army would just steamroll over the ragtag bunch of backwoodsmen of the Texan army. The Mexican army had to march all the way from central Mexico to Texas through some pretty rough terrain. It's a lot of desert throughout there. There's mountains, there's plateaus, rough country, basically all the way from Mexico City to Texas. And the logistics of moving a really large army through northern Mexico, they were not prepared for in the least bit. And that really hurt the army. And although the winter in Texas, you may not compare it to maybe, say, Russia or upstate New York, or I think even where you live, you get some pretty rough winters, don't you?
It's happened. This last winter was pretty rough, so we get our 6 to 8 to 12 inches of snow occasionally.
Yeah, you wouldn't think of that in Texas, but the winter of 1836 was pretty severe by Texas standards, and it set record colds and snowfall even pretty far deep into northern Mexico. Santa Anna, he had a no mercy policy because the Texans were rebels and he was going to treat them as rebels. So when the army took a fort or met any resistance, they were not taking prisoners, and that leads us to the Battle of the Alamo.
Right, and then with their supply lines stretched so thin, it'd be very hard to accommodate prisoners or do anything with them. So it's sort of a pragmatism, but then also sending a very clear message to any other would-be rebels or any would-be Americans trying to settle illegally there, since they don't have strong fortifications to defend it. So,
yeah.
All right, so let's get to the movie itself and see how closely it hews to the overview that you just gave.
So there's a lot of setup there, but I think it's important to understand where things stood right before the battle. And the movie develops a lot of what I said in that conflict in the plot, but not entirely. Like, they didn't get into the mission system and all that. But they got into the biographies of a lot of people like William Travis. For example, he was the commander of the regular Texas Army soldiers at the Alamo, and he was a real prince. He abandoned his family in South Carolina and just left all of his debts with his wife, which I don't believe he ever saw her again after he had left. He did have some connections with his son. Jim Bowie, he had a checkered background, and he bopped all around the southeastern U.S., getting into fights and conflicts with his gigantic Bowie knife, which is named after him. And I think he had been stabbed several times. He still had bullets lodged in his body. And I think he was leaving some sort of like debt situation. And Bowie was the commander of the volunteer contingent at the Alamo. David Crockett, he was a U.S. congressman who ran into some political troubles in Washington. I think it went back to, he had a fallout with Andrew Jackson, I believe, and there was all sorts of stuff that had been going on in the 1830s within the Democratic Party. But his district back in Tennessee voted him out of office, and even at this point, Crockett was way more legend than man, and he had a famous line, "You can all go to hell and I shall go to Texas," and he told that all around the parties in Washington, and they showed some part of his scene with Billy Bob Thornton. I think that was the star of the movie. He did such a great job as Crockett, as somebody who is a cynical politician, but also knew he was a legend. You know, he was a hybrid of politician and backwoodsman. He was all of those things at one time. And I think Billy Bob Thornton just did a great job folding that all together.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
Yeah, good guy to play a skinny, wiry, really crazy guy. He nailed it. And with Davy Crockett's personality, there's, I don't know, maybe a little bit of a Teddy Roosevelt, maybe not quite the polish of Teddy. The knowing representation of himself as a backwoodsman to really try to sell the frontier spirit that he has. He was an actual frontiersman, but he was also doing marketing, sort of like when Benjamin Franklin was an ambassador in France and would wear a coonskin cap, even though he had never lived in a cabin and probably never slept in one his entire life. Crockett had more claim to that, but like Franklin, also a bit of a showman.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, Davy Crockett was everything that Teddy Roosevelt wanted to be, but we could lose a lot of listeners if we bash Teddy Roosevelt too much.
Yeah, I mean, he did some, he was rough, don't get me wrong, but he liked to play cowboy in some senses, and he actually did up in Montana for a few years, North Dakota.
Yeah. Now, this divided command structure between regulars led by Travis and the volunteers led by Bowie, you've got two really big personalities, and then you have the regulars who think they're better than the volunteers, and the volunteers who think they're better than the regulars. I mean, they were ready to fight each other before they were going to fight the Mexicans. And, Travis thought that he should be in overall command because he was the leader of the regulars. And Bowie, on the other hand, was extremely popular and was seen to be the better fighter. Some also thought that Crockett should take command, and he kind of demurred away from all of that. But the practical matter was solved when Bowie, he became very sick shortly into the siege. And the siege took just about a week. And for all the heroics, the battle only lasted a few hours. The Alamo just wasn't made to be a defensive structure, and the defenders really didn't have the time or the resources to truly set it up to defend itself against the cannons and the siege equipment that the Mexican army had. Now, William Travis, he was killed very early in the action, and eventually the Mexicans took the entire fort. Only a handful of defenders survived, and, they basically, when the Mexican Federals went into when they finally did break through the walls, they just killed everyone on the spot. Somewhere about 6 defenders survived, and this movie included Davy Crockett amongst that small number of survivors. First-hand accounts show that Crockett died in the fighting, but there's also a controversy since the day, the March 6th of 1836, whether Crockett died fighting or was executed the next day. There's a really big controversy over that. But one way or the other, Crockett did die, and over 200 of the defenders died or were executed at the Alamo.
Yeah, I wonder what historians do with sources. I would assume that any accounts that we have would come from the Mexican side, since they survived and the Americans did not. or if there are other sources that we do have, since nobody would have left it there, and we're faced with a what's that situation? It was about 2,000 years ago in Israel when they were fighting against the Romans, and there was a mass suicide.
Masada.
Yeah, that's right. So it would be the Roman. So I don't know one way or another, and I would assume the Mexican accounts are what we have, but perhaps I could be wrong.
There's also, they touched on this in the movie, the Mexican army, they were not to kill African American slaves. They were to be taken and then freed. And Jim Bowie's slave, I don't know if he escaped or if he was caught in the Alamo, and then he was brought to Santa Ana. And I believe he was one of the ones who was at when they were executing. And I want to say that he said that he didn't see Crockett there.
Oh, okay. That's good.
But I could be that one. I'm just shooting from the hip here. And I'm not. He was one of the witnesses. There was a couple. I think one of the people who wrote shortly afterwards, the general consensus is that Crockett died in the fort. The movie actually went with the theory that he died outside of the fort the next day.
Okay, so they're at least hitching their cart to a horse that is, part of one camp of respectable opinion. And the other thing, too, about one of Jim Bowie's slaves, I would imagine that the Mexican army had a policy and would want slaves to get word of, join us and you will be emancipated. I don't know if they did that or not, but that is a time-honored strategy that's used by the Union, made it known to any slaves in the Confederacy. It's used in the Revolutionary War, where the British make it known to slaves that if you get behind our lines and fight for us, you will be emancipated. So it's a way to try to sap the manpower and maybe stir up a revolt to weaken your enemy forces. So, yep, Mexico is prosecuting a pretty smart war here.
Yeah, they're treating them like rebels. And you know what? Well, we'll see in a few minutes whether that strategy completely worked or not. Now, the defenders of the Alamo, they were really never supposed to defend the Alamo the way they did. They did tie up Santa Anna's forces for some amount of time, but not really for very long. And a lot of people died in the meanwhile. Later in March, Santa Anna fought it out in another town, a little village about 100 miles south and east of the Alamo called Goliad. And another group of Texans tried to fight toe-to-toe with the Mexican army, and that didn't work out well at all either. The Texans were soundly defeated at Goliad, and again, no mercy was granted to the Texan commanders or soldiers. Santa Anna ordered approximately 430 captured soldiers to be summarily executed as rebels, just like the Alamo defenders. And it's probably worth saying that a lot of the Mexican commanders did not want to do this. They were really against this policy, and they thought it was against the rules of war, and were not happy to do Santa Anna's biddings on that issue. In the meanwhile, Sam Houston was given command of the Texan army, and they were able to organize and get somewhat of their stuff together, so to speak. Houston always wanted to use hit-and-run strategy against the Mexican armies, and then to just keep drawing them in to lead them to a place where he knew he could have the upper hand, because he knew they could never go toe-to-toe fighting the Mexican Federals against, using the Mexicans' battle strategy. It was just never going to work. But that hit-and-run and running basically strategy was not super popular with many Texans, because they wanted instant revenge for all their family and friends and neighbors who had been massacred, not only at the Alamo but also at Goliad. But Houston was able to hold out, and Houston was able to lead Santa Anna along a series of several small battles, which was called the Runaway Scrape. And finally, Houston found the right ground at a place called San Jacinto, where the Texas army just hit the Mexicans hard when they were resting in their camp